The first hard freeze came early that year, late October 1901, too early for most men to take it seriously, but early enough to expose what they had not prepared for. The wind came out of the northwest, steady and dry, carrying a cold that didn't settle, it stripped. In a small settlement outside Elk River, Minnesota, a man named Daniel Hargrove stood in his yard watching his neighbor do something that made no sense at all. Across the fence line, a widowed woman named Annika Petrov was stacking snow. Not clearing it, not shoveling it away from her home like everyone else, stacking it, deliberately, packing it tight along the north wall of her small cabin and woodshed, layer by layer, like she was building a wall out of winter itself. Daniel leaned on the fence post and shook his head. "Snow melts," he called out. Annika didn't look up. She pressed another shovel load into place, compacted it with the flat of the blade. "It freezes," she said. "That's worse," Daniel replied. "Turns to ice, pulls heat out of the wall." She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just kept working. That was how most people in that settlement described her. Quiet, precise, uninterested in convincing anyone of anything. She had arrived 2 years earlier, after her husband died in a logging accident near Duluth. No children, no family nearby, just a claim, a small cabin, and a way of doing things that didn't match anyone else's. The first winter, people assumed she would leave. The second, they assumed she would adapt. By the third, they realized she wasn't changing anything. And that made people uncomfortable. Because when someone refuses to follow what everyone else accepts as necessary, it forces a question no one wants to ask. What if they're not wrong? By early November, Annika had built her snow wall nearly 3 feet thick along the entire north side of her cabin. She didn't stop there. She extended it around the west wall, halfway along the east, leaving the south side open, facing the low winter sun. Daniel watched the whole process with growing irritation, not because it affected him, but because it contradicted everything he understood. "Snow belongs away from the house," he told anyone who would listen. "Water melts, ice forms, wood rots. That's how you lose a structure." He had seen it before. In '93, a neighbor's shed collapsed after ice buildup warped the siding and split the beams. Moisture was the enemy. Everyone knew that. So why would anyone pack frozen water against their own walls? It wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. That's how it was talked about at the general store, at the smithy, after Sunday gathering. "She's burying her house. Wait until it melts. Won't make it to January." The usual tone, confident, dismissive, comfortable, because rejecting something is easier than understanding it. Annika finished the wall by mid-November. Then she did something else that drew even more attention. She stopped bringing firewood inside. Not completely, but differently. Instead of stacking it deep inside the woodshed along the north wall like everyone else, she moved most of it toward the center, away from the edges, away from where the cold pressed hardest. Daniel noticed that immediately. He walked over one afternoon, didn't wait for invitation. "You're storing your wood wrong," he said. Annika wiped her hands on her coat. "Wrong for what?" "For burning," he said. "You keep it near the wall, stays dry, stays ready." She glanced at the stack, then back at him. "It freezes there." Daniel frowned. "Wood doesn't freeze." "It does," she said. "Not solid, but enough." "That's not how wood works." She picked up a split log, held it out. "Feel." He took it. Cold. Too cold. Colder than it should have been sitting inside a structure. He frowned deeper. "It's winter," he said. "Everything's cold." Annika shook her head. "Not the same." He handed it back, dismissed the thought, because it didn't fit. And anything that doesn't fit gets rejected first. "You'll see," he said. She nodded once. Yes. By late November, the temperature dropped. Not sharply, but steadily. Days hovered just below freezing, nights dipped into the teens, then single digits, then below. The kind of cold that doesn't shock. It settles, builds, prepares. And in that preparation, small differences begin to show. Daniel noticed it in his woodshed first. The logs along the north wall felt different, not just cold, rigid, harder to split, harder to catch flame. He didn't think much of it, at first, blamed the wood, blamed the air, blamed anything except the pattern. Because patterns take time to reveal themselves. By the first week of December, the cold deepened, 10 below, then 15, then held. Wind picked up, not violent, but constant. It pressed against the north side of every structure in the settlement, pushed through seams, pulled heat outward, relentless. Daniel fed his stove more often, morning, midday, evening, night, the usual rhythm. But the wood wasn't responding the same. Logs taken from the north stack took longer to ignite, burned unevenly, produced less heat initially, like they had to thaw before they could burn. He mentioned it once at the store. "They're just cold," someone said. "Bring them inside sooner. Stack them tighter. Use better wood." Plenty of explanations, none of them tested, because no one had a reason to question the system. It had always worked, until now. Across the fence, Annika burned less, not noticeably at first, but enough that Daniel saw it. Her chimney smoked less often, less aggressively, shorter burns. And still, her cabin stayed stable. No frantic feeding, no late-night tending, just steady. That didn't sit right. So one morning before sunrise, Daniel walked over. Not out of concern, out of curiosity. He knocked once. Annika opened the door. Warm air came out. Not overwhelming, but present, consistent. Daniel stepped inside and immediately noticed something. The air felt still. Not dry heat blasting from a stove, not uneven pockets, just balanced. He looked at the wood stack, positioned away from the walls, closer to the center. He walked over, picked up a piece. It wasn't cold, not like his. It had a baseline warmth, not heated, but not frozen either. He turned slowly, looking back at the door, at the snow wall outside, at the structure. And for the first time, he paused, because something small had just stopped making sense. And when something small stops making sense, it usually means something larger is about to change. If you pay attention to the things people dismiss first, you'll often find the ones that matter most. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. By the second week of December, the difference between cold and managed cold had begun to separate itself in ways that were no longer easy to ignore. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, persistent details, the kind that repeat, the kind that force attention. Daniel Hargrove noticed it first in the morning routine. He stepped into his woodshed before sunrise, as he had done every winter for years, and reached for the nearest stack along the north wall. The logs looked the same, split clean, stacked tight, dry by all appearances, But when he picked one up, it felt wrong. Not just cold, dense, heavy, in a way that suggested something had changed inside it. He brought it into the house, set it near the stove, waited, then tried to light it. The flame caught, then struggled, not failing, but not taking hold cleanly. The log hissed faintly, not from moisture you could see, but from something deeper, something locked into the grain. He added kindling, more air, waited longer than usual. Eventually, it burned, but the delay cost time, and in that kind of cold, time had weight. Daniel stared at the fire longer than he needed to, then reached for another piece, this time from a stack closer to the center of the shed. Same wood, same cut, same source. But it lit faster, cleaner, without hesitation. He frowned, didn't say anything, but the observation stayed. That afternoon he tested it again. Same result. North wall wood, slower. Center stack, faster. By evening, he had a pattern, not proven, but repeated. And once a pattern repeats, it stops being coincidence. It becomes a question. Across the fence, Annika Petrov was already working within that answer. Her wood stayed away from the walls, away from the surfaces where cold collected and held. She didn't rush it inside, didn't need to, because it never reached the same state of cold to begin with. Her system wasn't about drying wood. It was about preventing it from usable heat in the first place. Daniel walked over again that evening, didn't knock this time, just stepped up to the door and waited. Annika opened it before he raised his hand. "You felt it," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded slowly. "The wood," he said. "It's different." "Yes." "Why?" She stepped aside. He entered. The same steady warmth met him again. No rush, no blast, just presence. She walked to the wall, pointed to the north side. "Cold sits there," she said. He frowned. "Cold doesn't sit. It moves." "Heat moves," she corrected. "Cold stays." That stopped him. Not because he agreed, but because it forced him to reconsider the frame. She picked up a log from her stack, held it out. "Your wood sits against cold surface," she said. "It gives heat to it, slowly, all day, all night." Daniel nodded. "That's what happens." "And when you burn it," she continued, "you must first take that cold back out." He looked at the log, then back at her. "You're saying I'm heating the wood before I can burn it?" "Yes." That idea settled, quiet, uncomfortable, because it meant something simple had been missed, something obvious. He looked toward the snow-packed wall outside. "You're using snow for this?" "Yes." "That doesn't make sense." She walked to the door, opened it. Cold air edged in, but didn't rush, didn't dominate. She pointed to the packed snow. "Touch." He stepped out, pressed his hand into the surface, hard, dense, not loose powder, not melting, solid, stable, insulating. "It doesn't move," she said. He looked back. "What?" "The air," she said. "It cannot move through this." He stood there, understanding forming slowly. Wind carried cold, movement stripped heat. If movement stopped, loss slowed. He stepped back inside, closed the door. "And the wood?" he asked. "Stays above that cold," she said. "Not warm, but not empty." That word again. Empty. He hadn't used it before, but it fit. Wood near the wall felt empty. like it had been drained of something. Not moisture, not structure. Something less visible, something tied to how it responded to fire. "How much difference?" he asked. Anika shrugged. "Enough?" That wasn't a number, but it didn't need to be, because by the next morning, others had started noticing it too. At the general store, the tone shifted slightly, not fully, not openly, but enough. "My wood's taking longer to catch." "Mine too. Feels colder than it should." "Same pile as last year." No one connected it yet, not directly, but the symptoms were aligning. Daniel stood there, listening, saying nothing, because now he knew something they didn't, and he wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Pride takes time to move, especially when it has years behind it. By December 15th, the cold deepened again, 20 below, then 24, then held. Wind steady, unforgiving, the kind that doesn't need to be strong, just constant. Cabins began to show strain, not failure, but inefficiency. Fires burned longer, harder. Wood consumption increased, not dramatically, but enough to shift calculations. People began checking their stacks more often, recounting, replanning. Daniel made a decision that evening. Quiet, unannounced. He took 6 bales of straw from his shed, waited until dusk, then began stacking them along his north wall, 2 layers, pressed tight, just as he had seen Annika do. His son watched. "Why?" the boy asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He set another bale, pressed it into place, then said, "Because something's wrong." They worked in silence after that. By morning, the wall was covered. Not perfect, not precise, but close enough. That day the wind hit again, same direction, same force. Daniel stepped into the shed, waited, listened. There was a difference, not obvious but present, less movement, less sound. He reached for a log from the north side, lifted it. It still felt cold, but not as empty, not as drained. He took it inside, lit it. The flame caught faster, cleaner. He stood there watching, longer than necessary, then nodded once, to himself. That afternoon he walked to Annika's cabin, knocked. When she opened, he didn't hesitate. "It works," he said. She nodded. Yes, that was all. No explanation, no satisfaction, just confirmation. By the end of that week, 2 more men had begun doing the same, quietly, at dusk, out of sight, because admitting the idea openly still carried weight, still meant something, still required letting go of what had been certain. But winter wasn't finished, and the cold that was coming would not leave room for quiet adjustments. It would force decisions, visible ones, public ones, the kind that change how an entire place thinks, whether it wants to or not. By late December, the cold stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like pressure. Not something that passed, something that stayed. Something that leaned on every surface, every wall, every joint, every assumption. Temperatures fell past 30 below and did not rise again for 9 straight days. The wind flattened, not gone, but constant enough that it no longer came in gusts. It simply existed. And in that kind of cold, the smallest inefficiency became visible, not as theory, as consequence. The first real failure came from the Miller place, not dramatic, not all at once, just a slow collapse of control. Their woodpile had been stacked tight along the north wall of their shed since October. 40 yards of split oak, seasoned, dry, prepared with care. It should have lasted. It should have held. But by the 3rd day of the deep cold, Mrs. Miller noticed something she couldn't ignore. The fire wasn't responding, not failing, but lagging. She fed it, waited, fed it again. The stove grew hot near the iron, but the room stayed uneven. Cold lingered in the corners. Heat refused to spread. Mr. Miller blamed the wood. Too dense, he said, cut late. But the wood had been fine 2 weeks earlier. They both knew that. Neither said it out loud. By the 5th day, the problem worsened. It wasn't just slower ignition anymore. It was demand. The stove needed more wood to hold the same temperature. Not double, but enough to matter. Enough to change the pace of consumption. Mr. Miller went to the shed, pulled logs from the north stack, brought them inside, tried again, same result. He walked back out, stood in the doorway, looked at the wall, snow packed tight against it, wind pressing. He reached out and touched the interior boards. Cold, not surface cold, deep cold, the kind that sits, the kind that doesn't leave. He didn't understand it fully, but he recognized the pattern, and patterns forced decisions. That evening he walked across the field. Didn't speak at first when Annika opened the door. Just stood there, then said, "How long does it take?" She tilted her head slightly. "To change it," he clarified. She looked past him toward his property, toward the shed, then back at him. "One day," she said. "That's all? If you do it right." He hesitated, then asked the question that mattered. "How much straw?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped outside, walked a few paces into the snow, looked at the wind direction, then pointed. North, west, half east. He nodded, understood. Not all sides, only the sides that faced the pressure. He left without another word. That night, under a sky that looked brittle with cold, he began stacking, not carefully, not perfectly, but fast, because now, time mattered more than pride. By morning, the difference hadn't fully formed, but it had begun. The shed felt quieter, less movement, less pull. By the 2nd day, the fire told the rest. It caught faster, held longer. Demand eased, not dramatically, but enough to confirm. And once confirmed, the idea could no longer be ignored. Word began to move, not through announcements, not through agreement, but through observation. People noticed who was burning less, who was hauling less wood, who wasn't up at midnight feeding stoves. And slowly, they started asking. Daniel Hargrove became the first to speak openly, not at the store, not in front of everyone, but in smaller conversations. "It's the wall," he said. "What wall?" "The north wall." "What about it?" "Stop letting it take your heat." That phrasing confused people at first, because it suggested something most had never considered, that cold wasn't just something you fought inside the house, it was something you had to manage outside of it. The idea spread unevenly, some dismissed it immediately. Straw catches fire, snow melts, moisture rots wood. All true, all valid, but incomplete. Because they were arguing against risk, while ignoring the one already happening, wood freezing, heat disappearing, effort doubling. By December 28th, the divide was clear, not between rich and poor, not between prepared and unprepared, but between those who adjusted and those who didn't. On one side, sheds wrapped in straw and packed snow. On the other, bare walls facing the wind. The difference wasn't comfort, it was survival margin, and that margin began to show in numbers. Daniel tracked it quietly, not out of pride, but out of habit. He counted his wood, measured daily use. Before the change, he burned through 1 full stack in 6 days. After, the same amount lasted 9, 3 days. That was the difference. 3 days of heat, 3 days of survival, 3 days that could not be replaced once gone. He didn't tell anyone the number, but others reached it on their own, independently, which made it harder to dismiss. By the first week of January, nearly half the settlement had made some version of the adjustment, some careful, some rushed, some poorly done, but all based on the same idea: stop the wind, hold the stillness, protect the wood. And through all of it, Annika Petrov did not change anything. She had built it that way from the beginning. She did not improve, did not adjust, because she had already solved the problem before it arrived. That fact settled quietly into the minds of those who noticed, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like the cold itself. And then the real test came, January 9th. The temperature dropped again, not gradually, not predictably. It fell from 28 below to 41 below in a single night. No wind, no warning, just absence of warmth, the kind of cold that doesn't move, doesn't howl, doesn't announce itself. It simply removes everything that isn't held. Fires struggled across the valley, even in houses that had adjusted, because this kind of cold tested not just systems, but limits. At the Miller place, the stove ran nearly constant, but held barely. At Daniel's, the fire burned steady. Wood consumption rose slightly, but remained controlled. At 3 homes that had not changed, failure came quickly. Wood refused to catch, then burned unevenly, then collapsed into poor coals. Heat output dropped, not because the fire was weak, but because the fuel had been drained too far, too long, too deeply. Before it ever reached the flame, those families adapted fast. They had no choice. By morning, every one of them had begun stacking straw. No more waiting, no more discussion, just action, because the cold had made the argument for them. That afternoon, a man named Elias Boone walked across the frozen ground to Annika's cabin. He had been the loudest critic, the most certain, the most dismissive. He stopped at her door, knocked once. When she opened, he didn't speak right away, didn't look inside, didn't ask permission. He simply said, "I was wrong." She nodded once, not in victory, not in satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because correctness didn't matter anymore. Only survival did. Elias continued, "How much straw do you have left?" She glanced toward her stack, then back at him. "Enough to share." That was how it changed. Not through agreement, not through apology, but through need, real need, the kind that strips everything unnecessary away. By the end of that week, every shed in the settlement had some form of windbreak, some clean, some crude, but all serving the same purpose: to stop the loss before it began. And the difference became undeniable, not in theory, not in opinion, but in what remained: wood piles, energy, strength, time. The cold had not become easier, but it had become manageable for those who learned, and impossible for those who waited too long. Winter had taken its measure, and for the first time, the valley had something it didn't have before: not just preparation, not just experience, but understanding, the kind that stays long after the cold is gone. By mid-January, the cold finally began to loosen its grip. Not gone, but softened, the kind of cold that still bit your lungs, but no longer held the land in a permanent choke. The wind shifted first, then the mornings rose, not warm, just less deadly. And with that shift, something else changed. People stopped reacting and started thinking. They walked their properties differently, slower, more observant, looking not just at what had survived, but why. Daniel Hargrove stood in his shed one morning, running his hand along the inside of the north wall. No frost, no damp. The boards felt like wood again, not iron. He stepped outside and looked at the straw, still packed, still holding shape beneath the snow. He didn't see it as insulation anymore. He saw it as control, control over air, control over loss. That was the difference. Across the valley, others reached the same conclusion in their own way. The Millers began rebuilding their shed walls tighter, adding a gap between wood and storage, planning for movement of air instead of ignoring it. Elias Boone did something no one expected. He rebuilt his entire wood shed. Not larger, not stronger, but smarter. He left space where he once sealed, blocked wind where he once assumed it didn't matter, and when someone asked him why, he didn't dress it up. Because I don't plan to learn the same lesson twice. No one laughed, because no one had forgotten how it felt. The deep cold had burned that memory into them, not as fear, but as clarity. And at the edge of it all, Annika Petrov remained exactly as she had been. Quiet, working, stacking, preparing, the same rhythm, the same method, the same understanding. One afternoon, Daniel approached her again, not with questions this time, just observation. "You knew," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I remembered." He frowned. "From where?" She paused, then answered simply, "From places where winter doesn't forgive mistakes." That was enough, because now they understood what that meant. This wasn't cleverness, it wasn't invention, it was memory, knowledge carried forward, instead of rebuilt from failure. By February, the valley looked the same as it always had: snow, smoke, tracks in the frost, but underneath, something had shifted. No one spoke about it openly. There were no speeches, no declarations, just small permanent changes, sheds built differently, wood stacked away from exposed walls, wind considered, air respected, and the quiet understanding that what seems small is often the difference between holding heat and losing it. On the last cold morning of the season, Elias stood outside his shed with his son. The boy touched the straw lining, pressed his hand into it. "Does this really matter?" he asked. Elias looked at the wall, then at the wood stacked safely behind it, then out across the valley. "It matters," he said. "How much?" Elias thought for a moment, then answered, "Enough to keep you alive when everything else tries not to." The boy nodded, didn't fully understand, but he would. One winter, maybe not the next, but eventually, because winter always comes back, and when it does, it asks the same question every time: not how strong you are, not how much you have, but whether you understood what mattered before it arrived.